What if the most dangerous thing inside a famous house wasn't an intruder, but the silence? Think about that for a second. A mansion in Brentwood, tree-lined streets, security gates, a last name that means success, laughter, influence, decades of Hollywood credibility. From the outside, this is the kind of place where nothing bad is supposed to happen. The kind of family people assume has already beaten life. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And yet, on a quiet Sunday, everything collapsed. Not in public, not on a red carpet, but behind closed doors, where no cameras were invited and no scripts existed. Here's the question no one wants to sit with. How does a family that had everything end up at the center of a crime so shocking that even seasoned investigators stopped and said, something here doesn't add up? Because this story isn't just about what happened that night. It's about what didn't happen for years before it. The phone calls that weren't returned. The conversations that were postponed. The problems everyone agreed to pretend didn't exist. We pretended everything was fine while the house was falling apart. That line changes everything. And once you hear why, you can't unhear it. From the moment the news broke, the headlines moved fast. Too fast. A famous filmmaker, his wife, both found dead in their own home. Their adult son arrested the same night. 2 counts of first-degree murder. A guest house on the property. A daughter's frantic call to police. Words like dangerous and family member suddenly appearing in official reports. But headlines don't tell you how a family actually breaks. They tell you what happened at the end, not how people lived at the beginning. And if you're honest, that's the part that makes this story uncomfortable. Because the version of events that fits neatly into a headline is simple. Almost too simple. A son snaps. A tragedy occurs. Case closed. Except real life is never that clean. Real life is messy, contradictory, full of people doing the wrong thing for reasons that made sense to them at the time. So before we even talk about that night, before we talk about arrests or charges or courtrooms, we have to rewind. We have to go back to the version of this family that everyone thought they knew. A successful father whose name carried weight. A mother who stood beside him. Children who grew up inside privilege most people will never experience. Private schools. Connections. Doors opening before they were even knocked on. From the outside, it looked stable, secure, protected. But here's the thing about families like this. Pressure doesn't disappear just because money exists. In many cases, it multiplies. Expectations get heavier. Failure becomes unthinkable. And asking for help feels like betrayal. So let me ask you something, and don't answer out loud yet. Have you ever been in a situation where admitting the truth felt more dangerous than lying? Where saying, "I'm not okay," seemed like it would cause more damage than staying silent? Now imagine that feeling doesn't last a week or a month. Imagine it lasts years. Inside this house, according to emerging accounts and alleged statements, problems didn't explode. They leaked. Slowly. Quietly. In ways that were easy to dismiss if you didn't want to look too closely. A grown son still living on the property. Boundaries that blurred. Dependence mixed with resentment. Support that came with conditions. And no one wanting to be the person who said, "This isn't working." Because once you say that, you can't take it back. Instead, everyone kept going. Family dinners. Polite conversations. The appearance of normalcy. That's the part people outside the house don't understand. They assume danger announces itself loudly. That violence wears a warning label. But most of the time, it doesn't. Most of the time, it hides behind routine. Neighbors see nothing unusual. Friends hear nothing alarming. Even family members convince themselves that what feels wrong is probably just stress, or a phase, or something that will sort itself out. Until it doesn't. When authorities later confirmed the deaths, the language was clinical. Multiple sharp force injuries. Homicide. Date of death. Cold phrases meant to establish facts, not feelings. But facts alone don't explain how a family gets there. And that's where this case becomes disturbing in a deeper way. Because as more details surfaced, one thing became clear. This wasn't a random act. This wasn't a stranger. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This was intimate, personal, and rooted in a long history that most people never saw. According to reports, the bodies were discovered by the couple's daughter, Romy, who contacted authorities and reportedly described concerns about a dangerous family member. That single detail shifted the entire narrative. Think about that. Imagine being the person who makes that call. The person who has to say those words out loud. The person who realizes that what's happened can't be undone, and that the truth will tear the family apart no matter what. In that moment, loyalty and survival collide. Do you protect the family name, or do you protect reality? There is no version of that choice that doesn't haunt you. Meanwhile, Nick Reiner was arrested the same night. 32 years old, living in the guest house on the property, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The public reaction was immediate. Shock, disbelief, speculation. Social media doing what it always does, filling the silence with theories. But here's the contradiction that refuses to go away. If this was sudden, why do so many pieces point backward? Why do people close to the situation keep circling the same phrase? We pretended everything was fine. Pretending isn't accidental. It's deliberate. It's a choice people make when they believe the truth is too disruptive to face. And in families with power and status, disruption is the enemy. Because disruption threatens the image, the legacy, the story everyone has agreed to tell the world. So instead of asking, "Is everyone okay?" the unspoken rule becomes, "Don't rock the boat." And that rule can turn toxic. Over time, roles solidify. One person becomes the fixer. Another becomes the problem. Another becomes the peacemaker. Another becomes invisible. Nobody steps outside their role because the system depends on it. Until one person can't do it anymore. Investigators would later focus on timelines, movements, and statements. Legal teams would dissect words line by line. Prosecutors would argue intent. Defense attorneys would argue context. But long before any of that, there was a family dynamic quietly decaying under the surface. A grown son who, by many accounts, never fully separated from the orbit of his parents. Financial ties, emotional ties, a living arrangement that kept everyone close but not necessarily healthy. Close enough to feel watched. Close enough to feel controlled. Close enough to feel trapped. And here's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Proximity doesn't equal connection. You can live 10 feet from someone and still feel completely alone. You can share meals and share a roof and still feel like there's no space to breathe. If resentment has nowhere to go, it doesn't disappear. It accumulates. It mutates. It waits. That's why the idea that everything was fine matters so much. Because fine is often the word people use when they're exhausted from pretending. Fine means don't ask. Fine means I can't explain this without blowing everything up. Fine means we'll deal with it later. But later always arrives. And when it does, it doesn't knock politely. As the case moved into the public eye, one thing became clear. There were competing versions of reality. What neighbors thought. What friends assumed. What family members experienced privately. What investigators could prove. And somewhere between those versions sits the truth. Not a simple truth. Not a comforting one. But a truth shaped by years of silence, pressure, and unresolved conflict. This isn't just about violence. It's about what happens when families confuse stability with avoidance. When love gets tangled with control. When help comes with strings attached. When speaking up feels like betrayal. Ask yourself this. How many families do you know that look perfect from the outside? How many of them are one honest conversation away from collapse? Because the most chilling part of this case isn't the crime itself. It's the realization that, according to those closest to it, the warning signs weren't invisible. They were ignored. And now, everyone is left asking the same question. If someone had stopped pretending earlier, would any of this have happened? Or was the damage already too deep by the time anyone noticed? Because the truth is, this story doesn't begin with an arrest. It begins with years of pretending. And what comes next will force us to confront exactly how far that pretending went and what finally shattered it beyond repair. But before we get there, we have to step inside the house itself. The place that looked perfect, felt safe, and quietly became the center of everything that went wrong. Because once you understand the house, you start to understand the fracture. And once you understand the fracture, what makes a house feel like home? Is it the furniture, the photos, the smells? Or is it the people inside it? In the case of the Brentwood estate, it was all of that, and none of it. From the outside, this was a classic Hollywood dream. A sprawling property tucked behind gates, manicured lawns, walls lined with memorabilia, awards, and portraits of the family smiling at milestones carefully curated over decades. Visitors saw elegance, stability, success. The kind of home you'd envy in a magazine. But inside, appearances are deceptive. Because the walls that held memories also held secrets. And secrets have weight. Walk through that front door, and you'd feel something unusual. Not immediately obvious. Not something a camera could capture. It was in the silence between the laughter, the pauses in conversation, the way people moved around each other like they were always stepping lightly, as if any wrong move could break the fragile equilibrium. Let me ask you this. Have you ever been in a room where everyone seems normal, and yet something feels wrong? That unease is subtle, almost imperceptible, but you can sense it. That's exactly what investigators later described when talking about the family dynamics. On the surface, they had all the signs of normality. Beneath it, the stress, resentment, and control dynamics were piling up like invisible bricks, waiting for someone or something to knock them over. Nick Reiner, the son, lived in the guest house on the property, a space separate from the main house, but never truly detached from the family's orbit. Adult, capable, but still tethered. That tether had threads you could barely see, emotional dependence, lingering expectations, and unspoken obligations. Neighbors would later remark that they often saw him come and go, but never noticed anything amiss. Friends visiting the main house spoke of polite dinners, polite conversation. Smiles were everywhere. Cameras would have captured nothing unusual, but that's precisely the point. Because silence is deceptive. Because pretending to be fine works until it doesn't. Over time, the boundaries blurred. Nick's life and the family's lives became intertwined in ways that made privacy impossible and tension inevitable. Control was exercised subtly, sometimes indirectly. Money, privileges, expectations. They were tools, invisible levers that shaped behavior without words. Imagine growing up in a household where the stakes for missteps are unspoken but enormous. Where every choice carries the weight of disappointment, judgment, and familial consequence. That weight doesn't vanish when you reach adulthood. It compounds. And what happens when someone finally reaches their limit? When the stress, pressure, and unspoken rules collide into a breaking point. This is where the story shifts from tense domestic drama to tragedy. Because the house that once felt like home became a stage for a series of decisions that no one could anticipate fully. It's easy to read the headlines and assume a snap. One sudden act of violence. But real life doesn't always work that way. In this case, several people familiar with the family indicated that warning signs had appeared over the years. Not public warnings. Private, subtle, often ignored. And each time someone stepped back or turned away, the pressure intensified. Think about it. How often do we ignore what's inconvenient to notice? How often do we see tension and call it stress? Or see irritation and call it personality? The layers of human behavior are tricky. The layers inside this house were dangerous. One of the most unsettling aspects was that despite proximity, no one truly communicated. The family practiced a form of polite avoidance. Disagreements weren't resolved. They were postponed. Hard conversations were never had. Conflicts simmered in silence. And with each layer of avoidance, the possibility of catastrophe increased. Meanwhile, the son, Nick, wasn't just living there physically. He was living in a psychological minefield. Boundaries weren't clearly defined. Expectations weren't clearly articulated. Love, care, frustration, resentment. They were all mixed in a complicated cocktail of dependency and control. The daughter, Romy, played a different role. She was observant, aware, and eventually the one who noticed the danger that no one else acknowledged. That phone call she made to authorities was a moment of clarity in a house full of pretense. It was an acknowledgement that what had been simmering beneath the surface could no longer be ignored. Ask yourself this. How do you know when silence stops being protective and starts being deadly? Experts in family dynamics often note that dysfunction doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly. Minor irritations, resentments, miscommunications, and control patterns slowly gain momentum. Like a snowball rolling down a hill, they pick up speed and mass, until suddenly there's no turning back. That's exactly what happened inside this estate. And here's the contradiction. Outwardly, they appeared to be a perfect family. Affluent, successful, smiling in pictures, hosting parties, attending premieres. Privileged in ways most people will never be. But internal pressure didn't recognize privilege. Internal pressure doesn't care about appearances. It only responds to stress and the inability to resolve it. By the time law enforcement was called, years of tension had converged in a way that even close friends, neighbors, and insiders could not have fully anticipated. Investigators would later describe the scene as organized yet intimate, calculated yet emotional. Evidence pointed to pre-existing tension. But the dynamics that led to the events were psychological, not forensic. This is where it gets complex. Because the world outside this estate will always seek a single cause, a motive that's easy to understand. But in cases like this, the motive is layered, multifaceted, and deeply human. Anger, resentment, fear, love, obligation, control, betrayal, and all of it compounded over years in silence. So when Nick Reiner's name became public in connection with the tragedy, it wasn't just a shock. It was a revelation of the breakdown of the entire ecosystem of relationships inside the house. It also raised questions. How does a son reach a point where he allegedly feels he must act in such a devastating way? What role did long-term dynamics play? How did the family's public persona obscure private suffering? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are central to understanding what happened next. Because if you can trace the cracks in the family foundation, the small, everyday fractures, you start to see the path to the breaking point. The guest house, once a symbol of privacy and independence, becomes a witness to tension, arguments, and isolation. The main house, once a symbol of stability, becomes a stage for silent conflict. And the spaces between them? They are filled with unspoken rules, unaddressed grievances, and moments that could have prevented the inevitable. And that's the paradox. Everything looked fine until it wasn't. Everything was polite until it wasn't. Everything was silent until it screamed. Now, as authorities pieced together what led to the events, one thing became strikingly clear. The patterns of avoidance, the pretense of normalcy, and the private pressures weren't peripheral. They were central. Ask yourself this. In your own life, are there situations where pretending maintains peace at the cost of safety or sanity? How long can silence protect before it destroys? Inside this house, those questions weren't theoretical. They were reality. And when the night of tragedy arrived, all the pretending, all the hidden tension, all the unspoken resentments collided in ways that would shock everyone who had ever assumed the family was untouchable. Because what happened that night didn't just break a family. It exposed the fragility hidden behind decades of success and smiles. And that fragility is where we begin to understand the choices Nick allegedly made. Choices shaped not in an instant, but over years of emotional strain, expectations, and quiet battles. Choices that no one outside the house could have predicted. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What was it like to live under that roof when everything was falling apart quietly? Picture this. A sprawling estate, polished floors, sunlight spilling across expensive rugs, and walls lined with accolades. Every corner whispered success, every frame a memory curated to perfection. Visitors felt awe. Outsiders assumed happiness. Everyone assumed safety. But inside, the air was heavy. Not with dust, not with neglect, but with the weight of words left unsaid, of emotions bottled up, of expectations silently enforced. Every conversation had a subtext. Every smile carried tension. Every glance carried judgment. Nick Reiner, the son, lived just a few feet away in the guest house, but proximity didn't equal freedom. He was constantly near the epicenter of control, expectation, and legacy. He wasn't just a son. He was a fixture in the unspoken hierarchy. Rules existed, but they weren't written. Obedience wasn't requested, it was implied. Think about it. Have you ever lived somewhere where the boundaries are invisible, yet every misstep is noted? Where what you can and cannot do isn't explained, but the consequences are always looming. That was the environment Nick allegedly navigated. Family members didn't just coexist, they performed. Performance was survival. Smiles at dinners. Polite conversation at gatherings. Head nods when tension rose. Pretending was the language everyone spoke fluently. And pretending, over time, became a cage. The daughter, Romy, understood it differently. She observed the patterns, felt the undercurrents, and at some point, realized that the danger wasn't abstract. It wasn't hypothetical. It was real, present, and escalating. Her eventual phone call to authorities wasn't just an act of reporting. It was a crack in the system of silence that had protected everyone for so long. Financial pressures added another layer. Despite appearances of wealth and privilege, the dynamics of control, allowances, and dependencies shaped behavior in subtle but powerful ways. Money wasn't just money, it was leverage. It was a silent enforcer of compliance, a way to reward, to punish, to manipulate, without speaking a single word. And then there was the emotional landscape. Love and obligation entwined with resentment and frustration. Every choice carried weight. Every misstep was magnified. Every expression analyzed. Emotions weren't free. They were currency, and they had a price. As the days approached that fateful Sunday, these pressures didn't vanish. They accumulated, invisible to the outside world, but tangible inside the walls. The family continued their routines. The son continued his proximity. The daughter continued her vigilance. And the parents continued their performance of normalcy. It's easy to imagine a snap, a sudden eruption. But in reality, according to those who later recounted the dynamics, the pressure cooker had been heating for years. It wasn't a single moment. It was a sequence of interactions, conflicts, silences, and compromises that created a perfect storm. And yet, despite this, the world outside remained blind. Neighbors saw nothing unusual. Friends assumed everything was fine. Social media presented curated images of success, smiles, and celebrations. This raises a question. How often do we mistake surface appearances for truth? How often do we see what people want us to see and ignore what's underneath? Inside this house, ignoring the warning signs wasn't just a mistake, it was part of the pattern. Silence and denial weren't anomalies. They were tools used by everyone to maintain the fragile equilibrium. But tools can become weapons. By the time the authorities arrived, the system of pretense had broken. It couldn't contain the pressure anymore. The guest house, the main house, the spaces in between, they all bore witness to years of unresolved tension. Every small act of avoidance, every unspoken resentment, every subtle manipulation had built momentum. And that momentum culminated in a night that would shock the world. Nick Reiner's alleged actions didn't occur in a vacuum. They were the result of a complex interplay of proximity, expectation, control, and emotional strain. Each layer of tension was a contributing factor. Each moment of silence, a missed opportunity to prevent disaster. And now, as the investigation unfolded, one thing became apparent. The story was far more complicated than any headline could convey. It wasn't just about a crime. It was about family dynamics, privilege, and the consequences of pretending that everything is fine when it isn't. Think about that. How many families around the world carry tensions beneath the surface? How many people silently navigate expectations, control, and emotional manipulation without realizing the potential consequences? Inside the Brentwood estate, those questions became literal matters of life and death. And as the case progressed, investigators began to piece together timelines, interactions, and patterns that showed just how fragile the family's equilibrium had been. Every missed warning sign, every unspoken conversation, every moment of denial became part of the larger puzzle. Because when silence dominates a family, it doesn't protect, it enables. And that is why the events of that Sunday weren't merely shocking. They were, in a sense, inevitable. The house that had once symbolized stability and success became a witness to the unraveling of a family. The spaces that were meant to provide safety instead highlighted vulnerability, and the relationships that were supposed to offer support instead created pressure. Ask yourself, if someone had broken the pattern earlier, could the outcome have been different? Or was the system of silence and pretense so entrenched that disaster was unavoidable? The answer is complicated. And it's exactly what we will explore in the next chapter. Because understanding the house, the guest house, the family dynamics, and the invisible pressures is key to understanding why that night ended the way it did. And what comes next will reveal the first cracks that led to the irreversible collapse of everything the Reiners had built. Have you ever walked into a house that looked perfect and felt like it was quietly screaming? That was the Brentwood estate. From the outside, it radiated success. Pristine landscaping, sun-drenched windows, doors that opened to spaces where Hollywood history lingered in every frame. Photos captured decades of achievement, awards gleamed in sunlight, and the family name commanded respect. Visitors were charmed. Outsiders assumed security, stability, happiness. But appearances can lie. Inside, there was a tension that no camera could capture. Not immediately visible. Not something a casual observer could put into words. But it was there, a low hum under every laugh, a pause in conversations, a stiffness in gestures. Emotional currents ran deep and often unnoticed until they collided. Nick Reiner, the son, lived in the guest house on the estate. Physically separate, yet inseparably tied to the family's orbit. For him, the boundaries between independence and obligation were blurry. Expectations weren't stated, they were implied. Control wasn't overt. It was woven into rules no one explained, but everyone followed. Ask yourself, how does it feel to live under constant, silent observation, with the knowledge that every action carries weight, yet no one will tell you exactly what that weight is? That was Nick's reality. The daughter, Romy, observed closely. She saw the subtle dynamics, the avoidance, the tension that lurked in polite smiles. She noticed that the house wasn't just a home. It was a stage, where every role had a script and deviation was punished silently. She became hyper-aware of the pressure, the unspoken expectations, and the danger that was quietly escalating. Pretending was the family's default mode. Pretending everything was normal, functioning, healthy. Dinner conversations were rehearsed. Questions about feelings were deflected. Disagreements weren't resolved, they were postponed. Emotional stress accumulated like snow quietly gathering on a roof. Every ignored sign of strain added weight, making the structure more unstable. And then there was money, not just as a privilege, but as a tool of influence. Allowances, privileges, and expectations were used to enforce behavior subtly. Rewards for compliance, quiet reprimands for missteps. Financial dynamics reinforced emotional patterns, creating a pressure cooker environment where independence was limited and autonomy came with consequences. Meanwhile, emotional complexity deepened the strain. Love intertwined with obligation. Frustration entwined with dependence. Resentment simmered beneath polite exchanges. Every interaction became a negotiation of feelings, each weighted by years of unspoken rules. By the time that fateful Sunday arrived, the tension had reached a boiling point. These were not isolated conflicts or sudden outbursts. They were cumulative. Years of pretense, avoidance, and unaddressed resentment created a combustible environment. And in such a house, the smallest spark could trigger a cascade of events that seemed sudden but were, in fact, long in the making. Neighbors and friends observed nothing unusual. Life outside the estate saw parties, smiles, curated images of success, a picture-perfect family. Yet inside, the dynamics were volatile. Every unnoticed warning, every ignored tension, every act of polite avoidance brought the family closer to a breaking point. That's the paradox of appearances. Outward perfection can mask inner chaos. And chaos, when contained by silence, doesn't vanish, it intensifies. So what exactly was happening in that house on the days leading up to the tragedy? Reports later revealed conflicting accounts. Some described minor arguments that escalated over nothing, while others pointed to persistent friction that had simmered for years. Private disputes remained private, leaving observers outside unable to grasp the magnitude of the tension. Every interaction was a thread in a larger web. Every ignored warning sign contributed to the eventual collapse. Silence, avoidance, and pretense became part of a pattern that no one inside could break and no one outside could understand. And then there was the psychological dimension. Being so close to the epicenter of familial control, while appearing independent, created cognitive dissonance. Nick allegedly navigated this landscape with constant awareness, balancing obligations, emotional demands, and subtle manipulations. Small slights or perceived failures became magnified, while accomplishments were often overlooked. The daughter, Romy, eventually recognized the danger that her family's silence was hiding. Her awareness and eventual actions highlighted the divide between perception and reality. To the outside world, she was just another member of a seemingly normal family. To herself, she carried the weight of recognizing an escalating threat that no one else acknowledged. Ask yourself this. How often do we ignore tensions because acknowledging them feels inconvenient or too painful? How often do small problems become unmanageable simply because they are left unspoken? Inside this estate, ignoring the cracks wasn't just a mistake. It was part of the environment that allowed pressure to accumulate. And that accumulation didn't just create stress. It shaped behavior. It guided decisions. It dictated interactions. It created conditions that would ultimately lead to an irreversible outcome. When authorities arrived on that tragic Sunday, the structures of pretense and avoidance had finally failed. The guest house, the main house, the spaces in between, they all bore witness to years of simmering tension. What appeared to be a sudden crisis was, in reality, the endpoint of a long, hidden process. Every unspoken conflict, every deferred conversation, every minor resentment had built momentum. And when the crisis erupted, there was no turning back. The collapse was as psychological as it was physical, a culmination of patterns established over decades. It's crucial to understand that this wasn't simply an instance of rage or impulsivity. According to reports and later reconstructions, the alleged events were shaped by years of complex interactions, emotional dependencies, and control dynamics. Every action had context. Every decision had history, and that context makes the narrative both fascinating and disturbing. It reveals how human relationships, when mismanaged, can create conditions where tragedy becomes almost inevitable. So before we delve into the night itself, before we examine the alleged actions and legal details, we need to grasp the forces at play inside the house, the pressures, the dynamics, the silent escalations. Because understanding the family environment is key to understanding why the tragedy occurred. And as we move forward, you'll see how the intersection of control, expectation, avoidance, and emotional strain led directly to the events that shocked a city, a community, and the world. Because what happened next didn't just end a life or a family. It revealed the hidden fragility beneath decades of appearances. Have you ever wondered what it's like to live in a gilded cage? To have every need met, every convenience within reach, but still feel trapped? That was the reality inside the Brentwood estate, a mansion that looked perfect from the outside but hid fractures few could see. Nick Reiner's life in the guest house wasn't freedom. It was proximity with strings attached. He was close enough to the family to feel controlled, yet far enough away to feel isolated. Independence was a mirage. Autonomy came with expectations that weren't always clear but were felt acutely. Every interaction, every conversation carried invisible rules. Break them, and you paid a psychological price. Obey them, and you might feel suffocated by obligation. And yet, this is exactly the kind of dynamic that makes dysfunction so invisible. Outsiders see the house, see the wealth, see the smiles, and assume perfection. They can't perceive the invisible pressures, the quiet resentments, the subtleties that, over time, accumulate into something combustible. Ask yourself this. How much strain can one person endure before a breaking point is reached? How long can you hold in resentment, obligation, and frustration before it spills over? Now imagine doing it under constant scrutiny, with every misstep magnified by family expectation and years of unspoken rules. The daughter, Romy, was a keen observer of these dynamics. While her parents and brother maintained the illusion of normalcy, she saw the subtle escalations, the way conversations became guarded, the way minor disagreements were postponed, the way silence was used to control and manipulate. She noticed the cracks that no one else wanted to acknowledge, the fissures that were quietly expanding beneath polished surfaces. Financial dependency added another layer of complexity. Money wasn't just money, it was leverage. Privileges and allowances enforced compliance. Subtle punishments and rewards shaped behavior without a single word being spoken. Independence wasn't just emotional. It was financial too, and every decision carried the implicit weight of consequences. Emotionally, the house was a pressure cooker. Love and loyalty were mixed with control and resentment. Bonds that should have provided safety instead became constraints. Frustration simmered beneath polite smiles. Every interaction demanded a performance, and the stakes were unspoken but high. By the time the events leading to tragedy began to unfold, years of pretense had built a house of cards. Minor conflicts, deferred conversations, and ignored warning signs compounded, creating a pressure that was nearly impossible to release safely. Every small act of avoidance made the eventual collapse more likely. What's chilling about this scenario is how invisible it was to outsiders. Neighbors saw nothing. Friends saw nothing. Social media showed curated images of smiles, celebrations, and milestones. To the public, the family appeared flawless. Inside, the undercurrents were lethal. Ask yourself, how often do we mistake appearances for reality? How often do we ignore the subtle signs of tension, choosing comfort over confrontation? In the Reiner household, ignoring the warning signs didn't just preserve appearances, it set the stage for disaster. Psychologically, Nick's position was precarious. He was close to the center of familial control while appearing independent. Each day required navigation through a maze of obligations, expectations, and subtle manipulations. Successes could go unrecognized. Failures could be magnified. Emotional responses had to be carefully calibrated. Misjudgments were not tolerated, and even minor slights could have major repercussions in the family hierarchy. Romy's awareness of the escalating tension marked a turning point. She saw what others ignored. Her eventual call to authorities wasn't just an act of reporting. It was an attempt to insert reality into a system of denial. Her recognition of danger contrasted sharply with the ongoing pretense maintained by others, highlighting the gap between perception and reality inside the estate. By now, the cumulative effects of silence, avoidance, and unspoken expectations had created a psychological environment in which conflict was inevitable. The systems that had once maintained family harmony now ensured that when conflict arose, it would be explosive. Investigators, when piecing together the timeline, noted that the environment had been volatile for years. Minor incidents, small disagreements, and ignored grievances formed a pattern that escalated over time. The pressures weren't new. They were historical, accumulated, and unresolved. Every unspoken word, every deferred conversation, every act of avoidance contributed to a trajectory that made tragedy almost inevitable. Silence and pretense became both shield and weapon, protecting the family's image while simultaneously increasing internal pressure. And when the night of the incident arrived, the invisible forces that had been at play for years converged. The guest house, the main house, and every space in between bore witness to the accumulated tension, each corner holding a story of restraint, of frustration, and of unacknowledged conflict. Ask yourself again, how long can pressure build before it explodes? How much unspoken resentment can one household carry before it becomes uncontainable? Inside the Reiner estate, the answers were about to be revealed in the most shocking way possible. What the world would see as a sudden, tragic event was actually the culmination of years of invisible pressure, mismanaged expectations, and a family bound together by obligation, love, and silence. And that brings us to the threshold of the fateful night. Because everything that followed wasn't random. It was the inevitable release of tension that had been accumulating quietly for years. The stage was set. The players were in position. And what happened next would leave a mark not just on the family, but on everyone who believed that appearances could be trusted. Inside the Brentwood estate, that collision had been quietly brewing for years. Every interaction, no matter how small, was filtered through a lens of obligation, unspoken rules, and silent judgments. The family's routine was a dance, carefully choreographed to maintain the appearance of harmony, while underneath, tensions simmered. Ask yourself, how much of your own life is governed by invisible rules, by expectations that no one explicitly states, but everyone seems to know? Multiply that by decades, add in wealth, fame, and proximity, and you begin to grasp the pressure Nick allegedly lived under. Living in the guest house, he wasn't fully independent. Every choice was influenced by the main house. Moods, expectations, subtle criticisms, and silent oversight. Financial arrangements, inherited privileges, and emotional obligations intertwined to create a system where autonomy existed only on paper. In practice, freedom was limited, and every decision carried weight beyond the visible. And yet, outwardly, the family looked perfect. Polished appearances, curated smiles, celebrations broadcast to a public eager to admire Hollywood success. Social media, parties, and red carpet appearances masked the reality. Control and pressure didn't leave footprints that outsiders could see. Inside, the dynamics were complex. Love intertwined with manipulation. Loyalty intertwined with obligation. Frustration simmered beneath polite conversation, sometimes spilling in ways that seemed minor to outsiders but were emotionally significant to those involved. Every meal, every gathering, every interaction carried undercurrents that outsiders would never perceive. Romy, the daughter, recognized these undercurrents early. She understood the delicate balance between observing and intervening. Her eventual call to authorities would demonstrate not only awareness but courage, because breaking the pattern of silence is never easy. It exposes the observer to risk, both emotionally and relationally. Ask yourself, how often do we notice problems but hesitate to act because we fear the consequences? How often do we pretend things are fine, hoping that silence will preserve peace? Inside the Reiner household, that hesitation was amplified by wealth, reputation, and family dynamics. The cost of speaking up was high, so silence became the default. Financial leverage further complicated matters. Money was more than currency. It was a tool of influence, subtly shaping behavior and reinforcing patterns of compliance. Independence was not just emotional, it was economic. The son's decisions were constrained by the intertwined pressures of privilege and obligation. Every choice carried potential reward or punishment, often unspoken but deeply felt. Emotional strain was equally pervasive. Love was intertwined with resentment. Care was mixed with control. Small frustrations escalated because the environment offered no safe space to process or release them. Every interaction became a negotiation, with stakes measured not in dollars or possessions, but in emotional currency. By the days leading up to the tragic Sunday, the pressures had reached a critical point. Years of pretense, deferred conversations, and unacknowledged conflicts had created an environment where the smallest spark could ignite disaster. Every unspoken grievance, every moment of avoidance, every subtle manipulation contributed to a chain of tension that no one could reverse. Investigators would later note that the family's outward perfection concealed layers of complexity. Social appearances misled outsiders, masking a household in which stress, resentment, and pressure had been accumulating invisibly for decades. Ask yourself, how many households carry hidden tensions beneath the surface? How often do minor conflicts escalate because they are ignored? And how long can individuals maintain composure under constant, invisible pressure before it finally cracks? In the Reiner household, the answer was about to manifest in the most tragic way imaginable. What the world would see as a sudden event was, in reality, the release of long-term accumulated stress, a convergence of control, expectation, and isolation that had been quietly building for years. The guest house, once a symbol of independence, became a witness to tension, observation, and isolation. The main house, once a sanctuary, became a stage for control, pretense, and emotional entanglement. And the spaces in between? They carried the echoes of arguments deferred, frustrations suppressed, and interactions avoided. This is why the dynamics of the family are crucial to understanding what happened. Nick Reiner's alleged actions didn't occur in isolation. They were the endpoint of a trajectory defined by invisible pressures, emotional strain, and relational complexity. So, as we move closer to the events of that fateful night, keep this in mind. The tragedy was not sudden. It was a culmination. It was predictable in hindsight. Every unspoken word, every ignored sign, every act of compliance contributed to the environment that made the events possible. And now, as the night approaches, the stage is set. The tensions are at their peak. The pressures are unbearable, and the choices made in that moment will alter everything. Because what comes next will show how years of subtle manipulation, obligation, and emotional strain exploded into a reality that no one could have contained. The day began like any other, but by the evening, nothing would ever be the same. It's strange how ordinary moments often precede extraordinary tragedy. A breakfast shared in silence, the faint hum of distant traffic, the clink of cups. These are the details that outsiders ignore. But inside the Brentwood estate, every routine was charged. Every action was filtered through years of expectation, obligation, and unspoken tension. Ask yourself, have you ever felt a sense of unease that you couldn't explain? Like the air itself was thick with things left unsaid? That's exactly what investigators would later describe about the house in the hours leading up to the events. The outward calm belied an internal storm. Nick Reiner moved through his day under the weight of proximity and scrutiny. Living in the guest house offered him space, but it didn't offer freedom. Every decision was influenced, every gesture noted. Independence was illusory. Emotional, financial, and psychological levers of control were omnipresent, subtle, and inescapable. Meanwhile, the main house maintained its facade. Polite conversation, carefully managed interactions, and curated appearances continued. But behind closed doors, the family's internal dynamics were fraying. Resentment and frustration simmered under layers of obligation and pretense. Emotional currents shifted imperceptibly, carrying the potential for escalation. The daughter, Romy, remained vigilant. She observed patterns, inconsistencies, and signs of mounting tension. Her awareness would prove crucial. It was her understanding of the situation and her eventual decision to act that would intersect with the unfolding events in a way that changed everything. Financial arrangements also played their part. Wealth, privilege, and expectations functioned as silent enforcers. Compliance was rewarded, deviation subtly punished. Nick's movements and choices were constrained not by explicit rules, but by these invisible pressures. Every day was a negotiation of autonomy, safety, and emotional survival. Ask yourself, how does long-term pressure shape decision-making? How does living under constant scrutiny, even in a seemingly safe environment, affect judgment, impulse, and emotional resilience? Psychologically, the household operated like a pressure cooker. Love, obligation, frustration, and resentment were compressed into every interaction. Minor irritations escalated because there was no safe outlet, no mechanism to relieve the tension. Every word, every glance, every small act had meaning beyond the immediate context. By the evening, the tension reached a tipping point. Years of pretense, avoidance, and unspoken grievances had accumulated. Patterns of silence and compliance had intensified the pressure rather than alleviated it. And the conditions were ripe for an event that would shatter the household and send shockwaves outward. Investigators would later describe this period as critical. The behaviors, the interactions, and the emotional state of each family member were part of a complex system in which any disruption could have dramatic consequences. The system, built on appearances, obligation, and pretense, could not absorb a breach without collapsing. The tragedy that unfolded that night did not occur in a vacuum. It was the product of accumulated tension, invisible pressures, and fractured relationships. Each action, each decision, each silent concession contributed to the environment in which the catastrophic event became possible. And yet, to the outside world, the evening may have seemed ordinary. No alarms, no visible arguments, no immediate signs that disaster was imminent. This contrast between appearance and reality underscores the subtlety of familial dysfunction. The danger was not obvious. It was hidden in plain sight. Ask yourself, how many environments around you function like this? Where tension, avoidance, and pretense create conditions for disaster that no one anticipates. How often do ordinary facades mask extraordinary dysfunction? Inside the Brentwood estate, those questions would soon be answered in the most devastating way imaginable. The intersection of control, expectation, isolation, and frustration reached its peak, and the choices made in that moment would have irreversible consequences. When the police arrived that Sunday evening, the world saw headlines. A famous filmmaker, his wife, both found dead. Their son arrested. 2 counts of first-degree murder. A guest house on the property. A daughter's frantic call to authorities describing a dangerous family member. But what the public didn't see, and what the headlines couldn't capture, was the complex web of family dynamics, silent tensions, and invisible pressures that had been building for years. That night wasn't just an isolated event. It was the culmination of decades of emotional strain, control, and avoidance. Ask yourself, have you ever witnessed a situation where appearances hid the truth? Where everything looked normal until it wasn't? That's exactly what investigators encountered inside the Brentwood estate. Nick Reiner, 32, had lived in the guest house for years, close enough to be influenced by the family, far enough away to feel isolated. Every decision he made, every action he took, was shaped by proximity, expectation, and an unspoken hierarchy. Independence was a mirage. Autonomy came at a cost. Every choice was filtered through layers of familial pressure. Romy, the daughter, had recognized these patterns long before the tragedy. She saw the subtle escalations, the avoided conflicts, the silences that carried more weight than words. Her eventual call to law enforcement wasn't just a report. It was a decisive break from the pattern of pretense that had dominated the household for years. The initial police response was procedural. Officers documented the scene, gathered preliminary statements, and secured the property. But even at this stage, it was clear that the outward appearance of the family, the smiles, the curated image of success, belied a deeper, more complicated reality. Evidence suggested patterns of long-term tension and psychological pressure that had not been visible to outsiders. Financial dynamics also played a critical role. Money, privilege, and obligations had been silently controlling behavior for years. Rewards and punishments weren't always verbalized, but they shaped daily life. Nick's movements, choices, and autonomy were influenced by both explicit and implicit rules that were invisible to anyone outside the estate. Emotionally, the household was a pressure cooker. Love and loyalty were intertwined with frustration and resentment. Obligations carried weight. Unspoken expectations dictated interactions. Each family member was performing a delicate balancing act, and even minor disruptions could trigger disproportionate reactions. Ask yourself, how long can someone maintain composure under constant scrutiny and invisible pressure? How long can minor grievances accumulate before they reach a breaking point? Inside the estate, these questions were no longer hypothetical. They were the reality. Investigators later noted that the family's outward perfection masked layers of emotional complexity. Social appearances misled neighbors, friends, and the public. What looked like normalcy was, in fact, a fragile equilibrium maintained by silence, compliance, and avoidance. And then came the revelations. Witnesses reported that minor conflicts had escalated quietly over time. Arguments were postponed, grievances were ignored, and emotional pressure continued to build. Each act of avoidance and pretense added to a psychological trajectory that would eventually culminate in disaster. The son's alleged actions that night were not spontaneous in isolation. They were the endpoint of years of accumulating tension, unspoken resentments, and complex relational dynamics. Every decision, every reaction, every suppressed emotion contributed to the conditions in which tragedy became possible. By the time the events unfolded, the guest house, the main house, and the spaces in between had all borne witness to years of silent escalation. The system of pretense that had maintained the family's image could no longer contain the pressure. And when the breaking point was reached, the consequences were irreversible. Ask yourself, how often do external appearances mask internal crises? How often do pressures, left unaddressed, create outcomes that seem sudden but are years in the making? Inside the Brentwood estate, the answers became all too real. The night that had seemed ordinary, uneventful, and mundane would instead reveal the full extent of the fractures hidden behind decades of curated smiles, polite conversation, and silent compliance. And the first moments of police intervention would only scratch the surface. What followed inside that house, the accounts, the evidence, the contradictions, would expose layers of tension, conflict, and family dynamics that no one outside could have anticipated. Because what came next didn't just shock the city or the world. It revealed the invisible pressures, the quiet resentments, and the complex web of relationships that had been simmering silently and dangerously for years. The phone call that Romy Reiner made to the authorities was the first audible crack in the house of pretense. Imagine the weight of that decision, the knowledge that calling for help would expose private family turmoil to the world. She wasn't just reporting a crime. She was confronting a lifetime of avoidance, silences, and unacknowledged tensions. Every word she spoke carried the burden of years of observation, suspicion, and fear. Ask yourself, What would it feel like to make that call? To be the person who interrupts the illusion, the quiet observer who finally acts? For Romy, it was a decisive moment, and it would set into motion events that no one could undo. Meanwhile, inside the house, Nick's world was closing in. Living in the guest house offered proximity, but also isolation. Every movement, every decision, every choice was observed, intentionally or unconsciously. Independence existed only as a concept. Autonomy came with consequences, financial and emotional. Every day was a negotiation of compliance and survival. Every interaction filtered through layers of expectation and unspoken hierarchy. And the dynamics weren't simple. Love mixed with obligation. Loyalty mixed with frustration. Every glance, every word, every gesture carried meaning beyond its immediate context. The family's communication style, polite, indirect, and often avoidant, magnified tension rather than alleviating it. Minor irritations escalated because they were never addressed. Disputes were postponed, not resolved. Resentments accumulated like unseen pressure beneath the surface. Financial influence compounded the stress. Privilege, allowances, and unspoken expectations functioned as silent enforcers, guiding behavior without explicit commands. Nick's autonomy was constrained by invisible rules, each day a careful negotiation between independence and compliance. Ask yourself, how much strain can a person endure before the pressure becomes unbearable? How long can silent resentment, compounded by control and obligation, accumulate before it manifests in ways that shock even those closest to the situation? By the time the tragedy struck, the estate was a powder keg. Years of pretense, avoidance, and unspoken expectations had created an environment in which the smallest spark could ignite a disaster. Every minor grievance, every suppressed argument, every quiet act of compliance had contributed to a trajectory that made the eventual outcome almost inevitable. Investigators later noted that the family's outward appearance, curated, polished, seemingly harmonious, belied the emotional complexity within. Social perceptions misled friends, neighbors, and the public. The facade of normalcy hid a volatile ecosystem of tension, obligation, and subtle control dynamics. Inside the house, the pressures reached a critical peak. The guest house, the main house, and the spaces between were all charged with accumulated stress. Years of subtle manipulation, unspoken resentments, and emotional obligation had created conditions in which tragedy was possible. And as Romy's call reached law enforcement, the system of pretense began to unravel. The carefully maintained equilibrium could no longer hold. The silence that had protected appearances instead exposed vulnerabilities. The pressures, long suppressed, erupted in a way that no one outside the estate could have anticipated. Ask yourself, how often do we mistake appearances for reality? How often do invisible pressures shape outcomes more than visible actions? In this family, the consequences of ignoring tension, suppressing conflict, and maintaining pretense would soon become devastatingly clear. Because the events that followed. The police arrival, the investigation, and the unraveling of the family narrative didn't just reveal a crime. They exposed decades of accumulated tension, control, and avoidance. Every choice, every interaction, every unspoken word had contributed to the conditions that made this night possible. And as authorities pieced together statements, timelines, and patterns, it became clear nothing about this situation was as simple as it seemed. The tragedy was the result of years of invisible pressure, complex family dynamics, and emotional strain that no one had addressed. But what came next would push the story from complexity into the realm of the unimaginable. Every detail, every piece of evidence, every revelation would force the world to confront how far the pretending had gone and what it ultimately cost. The charges were clear: 2 counts of first-degree murder. Simple words on paper, but they carried a weight that was anything but simple. First-degree murder is deliberate, planned, intentional. And yet, in this case, investigators and legal experts would later describe a picture that was anything but straightforward. Ask yourself, can you ever truly understand why someone makes a decision that ends a life? Especially when it happens inside a family, where love, loyalty, and resentment are tangled together in ways that defy logic. From the outset, The legal documents painted a procedural picture. The arrest, the charges, the reading of rights. It was all standard protocol. But beneath the surface, every line hinted at decades of complex family dynamics, patterns of control, unspoken expectations, and accumulated emotional pressure. In other words, the law was entering a storm that had been brewing quietly for years. Nick Reiner's alleged actions were not spontaneous. They were shaped by proximity, control, obligation, and frustration. Living in the guest house didn't offer freedom, it offered exposure. Every interaction, every movement, every choice was observed, weighed, and interpreted. Compliance was expected, deviation carried consequences. Financial dependence, subtle control, and emotional leverage made autonomy a delicate negotiation rather than a given. Meanwhile, the main house maintained its polished exterior. Polite conversations, curated appearances, and a veneer of normalcy continued. But behind closed doors, tension simmered. Resentments, frustrations, and unspoken grievances accumulated silently, creating an environment where the smallest trigger could set off a cascade of catastrophic events. Romy, the daughter, had long recognized these patterns. Her awareness and eventual decision to act, to call authorities, highlighted the divide between perception and reality inside the estate. She understood that silence, while maintaining appearances, allowed pressure to build to dangerous levels. Financial dynamics added complexity. Wealth and privilege weren't just a backdrop, they were active agents in shaping behavior. Allowances, inheritances, and implicit obligations functioned as subtle enforcement mechanisms. Nick's choices were constrained not by explicit rules, but by the invisible pressures of expectation. Every day required careful negotiation between autonomy and compliance.